The great chamber of the flagship Eternal, dominion hung with the quiet power of 1,000 systems working in perfect harmony. And the gathered commanders of the Corvathi hegemony sat in their elevated seats like gods passing judgment on lesser beings. Their scaled faces illuminated by the massive holographic display that dominated the center of the room. High Admiral Zorath watched from his seat of honor as the footage played, showing the first recorded engagement between Corvathi scout vessels and the newcomers to the galactic stage, the species that called themselves humans. And around him, the chamber filled with sounds of amusement that ranged from clicking mandibles to deep rumbling laughter. "What exactly am I watching?" asked Fleet Commander Threk, his young voice carrying the arrogance of someone who had never tasted defeat. "Is this supposed to be a military engagement or some kind of primitive mating ritual?" The laughter grew louder as the hologram showed, human vessels breaking formation and scattering in different directions. Their movements chaotic and seemingly random compared to the precise geometric patterns that define proper Corvathi warfare. Admiral Vorath, who sat at Zorath's right hand, leaned forward with contempt clear on his features. "They run before the battle even begins. These creatures have no honor, no spine, no understanding of what it means to face an enemy with dignity." The footage continued, and the assembled commanders watched as human ships disappeared into asteroid fields, ducked behind planetary bodies, and used every piece of cosmic debris as cover. Their behavior so alien to Corvathi doctrine that many in the chamber struggled to understand what they were seeing. "This is not warfare," declared Councilum Wrath, the eldest member of the War Council, whose victory stretched back 3 centuries. "This is the behavior of prey animals, scurrying and hiding like vermin fleeing from a predator. I am embarrassed that we are even discussing these creatures as a potential threat." A younger officer activated another segment of footage, this one showing a human ground engagement. And the laughter returned as they watched human soldiers crawling through mud and vegetation, their small bodies covered in materials designed to blend with their surroundings. "They paint themselves to look like plants," someone called out. "Perhaps they hope we will mistake them for shrubbery and walk past." The chamber erupted in amusement, and even the most disciplined commanders allowed themselves to join in the mockery. For the Corvathi had built their civilization on the principles of direct confrontation and overwhelming force, and the idea of hiding from an enemy was not just foreign to them, but genuinely incomprehensible. High Admiral Zorath remained silent throughout the display, his ancient eyes fixed on the hologram with an expression that none of his subordinates could read. And when the footage ended, he made no move to speak or add his voice to the chorus of derision. "The question before this council," said Councilum Wrath, rising to address the assembly, "is how we should respond to human expansion into the outer territories. And I believe the answer is obvious. We send a small fleet to remind these creatures of their place in the galactic order." Voices rose in agreement, and suggestions flew across the chamber about which young commander should receive this easy assignment. For defeating the humans was seen not as a challenge, but as a training exercise, a chance for inexperienced officers to earn their first taste of glory. "I recommend Commander Threk for this honor," said Admiral Vorath, gesturing to the young officer who straightened with pride at the mention of his name. "His tactical scores are exceptional, and this mission will provide him with practical experience before we assign him to more challenging fronts." Threk rose and saluted in the Corvathi fashion, his clawed hand pressed against his chest. "I am grateful for this opportunity, Admiral. I will bring swift victory to the hegemony and teach these humans the price of opposing our expansion." The council voted unanimously in favor of the assignment, and the chamber filled with congratulatory remarks and predictions of how quickly Threk would crush the human resistance. Some betting it would take mere days, while others generously allowed for a week or 2. Throughout all of this, High Admiral Zorath remained in his seat, his silence unnoticed by the celebrating commanders who were already discussing how the human territories would be divided and administered after their inevitable conquest. Only when the chamber began to empty did Zorath finally move, and his aide, a quiet officer named Keth, who had served the High Admiral for decades, approached with the deference that Zorath's reputation commanded. "You did not vote, High Admiral," Keth observed quietly, "nor did you offer your assessment of the human tactics. The Council was expecting your wisdom." Zorath rose slowly, his old bones protesting the movement, and he walked to the holographic display where the frozen image of a human soldier still hung in the air. The small creature's face partially hidden by its camouflage, but its eyes visible and staring directly at the recording device. "Do you know what I see when I look at this image?" "Keth," Zorath asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A primitive soldier employing primitive tactics." "High Admiral." Zorath shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the human's frozen gaze. "I see an ambush predator. I see a creature that has learned to hide not from fear but from cunning. I see something that waits in the shadows, not because it cannot fight, but because it chooses when and where the fight will happen." Keth shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to respond to his commander's strange words. "The Council sees prey," Zorath continued. "They see creatures that run and hide, and they assume this means weakness. But tell me, Keth, in all your years of service, have you ever known a prey animal to deliberately seek out conflict with a superior force?" "No." "High Admiral." "No," Zorath agreed. "Prey animals flee and stay fled. They do not send scout ships into our territory. They do not establish colonies on the borders of our space. They do not look at the Korvathi hegemony and see something to challenge rather than something to avoid." He reached out and touched the hologram, his clawed finger passing through the image of the human face. "I have conquered 37 species in my career. Keth, I have broken the Velith Combine and burned the Mrathian hive worlds. I have faced enemies with superior technology, and enemies with superior numbers, and enemies with nothing left to lose. And I have defeated them all because I understood them." Zorath turned away from the display and walked toward the chamber's exit, his steps heavy with the weight of years and knowledge. "I do not understand the humans, and that is what frightens me." Keth followed his commander out of the chamber, and behind them the hologram finally flickered and died, leaving only darkness where the human soldier's eyes had been staring with patience that bordered on the infinite. Commander Threk stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Crushing Tide, and surveyed the tactical display with the satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. For before him lay the human colony world of New Helsinki, with only 4 defending vessels standing between his 12 capital ships and total victory. "Pathetic," Threk announced to his bridge crew, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never experienced failure. "They send 4 ships against 12. Do they not understand basic mathematics? Do they think bravery alone will protect them from our weapons?" His second-in-command, a veteran officer named Vorth, who had served under Admiral Zorath in previous campaigns, watched the display with a frown that Threk chose to ignore. "Commander," Vorth said carefully, "the human ships are not moving to engage. They appear to be holding position near the asteroid belt. Perhaps we should consider why they would choose such a location." Threk dismissed the concern with a wave of his clawed hand. "They are frozen with fear, obviously, or perhaps they hope the asteroids will provide some protection. Either way, their tactics are irrelevant. We will sweep them aside and claim this world before the next cycle." He gave the order to advance, and his fleet moved forward in perfect Korvathi formation, a wall of warships that had crushed a dozen species and would crush a dozen more. And Threk allowed himself to imagine the glory that awaited him when he returned to the Council with news of his swift victory. The human ships began to move, but instead of advancing to meet the Korvathi fleet in honorable combat, they scattered, each vessel breaking away in a different direction, and accelerating toward the asteroid field with what seemed like desperate speed. They flee. Threk laughed, just as the council predicted. They are cowards who cannot face a superior force. All ships pursue and destroy. I want no survivors to spread tales of this day. Voreth stepped forward with urgency in his voice. Commander, I strongly advise against breaking formation. If we pursue individually, we will lose our tactical advantage. Our advantage is 12 ships against 4, Threk snapped. We could chase them with our eyes closed and still achieve victory. Execute my orders. The Korvathi fleet broke apart as each captain chose a target and gave chase. And the sleek warships plunged into the asteroid field where the human vessels had disappeared among the tumbling rocks and ancient debris. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the first explosion lit up the void the warship Dominant Fury had pursued its target around a large asteroid and found not one human ship but 3, waiting in ambush with weapons charged and targeting solutions already calculated. Before the Korvathi captain could even register his surprise, his ship was torn apart by concentrated fire from multiple angles. Threk watched in shock as another of his ships reported contact. Then another, and then the reports stopped coming because the ships sending them no longer existed. What is happening? He demanded. Where are they coming from? The sensors showed only 4 vessels. Hidden platforms, Varth reported grimly. They have concealed weapon emplacements throughout the asteroid field. Our ships are flying into prepared kill zones. Commander, we must withdraw and regroup. Before Threk could respond, a new alarm bled across the bridge, and the communications officer turned with fear in his eyes. Commander, our supply convoy, the ships we left at the jump point, they are under attack. Threk felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what had happened. The human retreat had not been flight at all. It had been bait. And while his fleet chased phantoms through an asteroid field full of traps, a human strike force had circled around to hit his vulnerable supply line. All ships withdraw immediately, he ordered, his voice no longer carrying its earlier confidence. Regroup at the following coordinates. But the withdrawal was not simple. For every path out of the asteroid field seemed to lead through another ambush. And Threk's captains found themselves navigating a maze of death where every shadow might conceal a weapon and every rock might hide an enemy. 3 more ships fell before the remnants of his fleet escaped. Trap Threk regrouped his forces and assessed the damage with growing horror. In a single engagement, he had lost half his fleet without ever facing the enemy in direct combat. And when he checked on his supply convoy, he found only debris and the fading signatures of human ships jumping to safety. We will adapt, Threk declared. Though his voice shook slightly, we will keep our formation tight and advance slowly. We will not fall for their tricks again. But the humans had more tricks over the following weeks. Threk's fleet was bled dry by attacks that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Human ships would appear at the edge of sensor range, fire a few shots, and disappear before the Korvathi could respond. Supply runs became suicide missions as human raiders seemed to know exactly when and where his convoys would travel. Officers began disappearing during shore leave on occupied stations. And those who returned reported seeing nothing, hearing nothing, until they woke up alone with their companions. Simply gone navigation systems began malfunctioning with increasing frequency, sending ships into dangerous regions of space or causing them to emerge from jumps far from their intended destinations. And when technicians investigated, they found subtle corruptions in the code that should not have been possible. Rex stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tactical display lighting up with the deaths of his ships. And every time he walked the corridors of his flagship, he felt watched by enemies he could not see. They are not fighting us, he said to Voreth one night. his voice hollow with exhaustion. "They are hunting us. They treat war like we are animals to be stalked and worn down until we collapse." Vorath had no words of comfort to offer, for he had come to the same realization after 6 weeks. Threk returned to the Eternal Dominion with 4 ships out of his original 12, and he stood before the council that had sent him off with such confidence and watched their expressions shift from expectation to confusion, to something he had never seen on Kolvathi faces before fear. "They do not fight like any enemy we have faced," Threk reported, his voice flat and dead. "They do not seek battle. They seek destruction. They do not want to defeat our ships. They want to break our spirits. They attack sleep and supply insanity with equal dedication. And they never, ever stop." The council listened in silence. And when Threk finished his report, they dismissed him without the mockery that had accompanied his departure. For there was nothing funny about what he had described. High Admiral Zarath watched the young commander leave the chamber, and he saw in Threk's eyes the same haunted look that Zorath had seen in his own reflection after his first extensive study of human history. The council voted to send a larger fleet. Zorath voted against, but he was outnumbered, and he knew that the lessons were only beginning. Admiral Vorath stood at the helm of the greatest armada the Korvathi hegemony had assembled in a generation. 40 warships bristling with weapons that could crack planets, crewed by veterans who had broken empires. And he had studied every report from Threk's failed campaign with the determination of someone who refused to make the same mistakes. "We will not chase shadows," he announced to his fleet commanders in a briefing that was broadcast to every ship. "We will advance slowly and methodically. We will check every asteroid and scan every debris field before we enter it. We will keep formation at all times, and we will never divide our forces for any reason." His captains listened with the grim attention of soldiers who had heard what happened to Threk's fleet, and they followed Vorath's orders with perfect discipline as the armada began its slow advance into human territory. For the first 3 weeks, Vorath's caution paid dividends. His forces detected and destroyed dozens of hidden weapon platforms. They captured 2 human outposts without significant casualties, and they pushed the human fleet back toward their core worlds with relentless pressure. "You see," Vorath declared to his staff, "the humans rely on tricks and deception because they cannot face us directly. Remove the element of surprise, and they are helpless. This war will be over within 2 cycles. But the humans were adapting too when conventional ambush failed. The humans changed their approach. Instead of attacking Korvathi ships, they began attacking Korvathi minds. And Vorath found himself facing an enemy that had studied his people with disturbing thoroughness. Water supplies on occupied worlds became contaminated with substances that did not affect humans but caused severe digestive problems in Korvathi physiology. Not lethal, but debilitating enough to reduce garrison effectiveness by half. Communication channels were infiltrated with broadcasts that played at all hours. The content designed with precision to prevent sleep. A mixture of sudden loud sounds and unsettling frequencies that the Korvathi brain could not ignore. And soldiers who had faced death without flinching began to break down after days without rest. Propaganda appeared everywhere, in languages the Korvathi could read, questioning why they were fighting so far from home, asking who would protect their families if the fleet was destroyed, wondering aloud whether the commanders cared about common soldiers or viewed them as expendable resources. Psychological warfare. Vorath growled when his intelligence officers presented their analysis. Primitive manipulation designed to weaken our resolve. "I will not be defeated by whispers and stomach problems." He pressed forward, and his fleet won battles. 3 human colony worlds fell to Korvathi occupation. Their defenders either destroyed or forced to retreat. And Vorath sent triumphant messages back to the council reporting his progress. But occupation was where the real nightmare began. Humans who had surrendered peacefully transformed overnight into resistance fighters. Farmers who had bowed their heads before Carvathi soldiers were found the next morning, holding improvised weapons over the bodies of dead guards. Children carried explosives in their school bags. Elderly citizens guided patrols into ambush sites with innocent smiles. They do not distinguish between soldiers and civilians. A garrison commander reported, his voice trembling, "Every human is a potential enemy. We cannot tell who will attack us and who will remain peaceful. They smile at us in the morning and slit our throats at night." Vorath responded with crackdowns and curfews and public punishments. But every harsh measure seemed to create 10 new resistance fighters. And the occupation forces found themselves trapped in a war. With no front lines and no clear enemy, a suicide bomber walked into a command center on the second occupied world and detonated an explosive vest that killed 30 officers. Survivors reported that the bomber had been smiling, actually smiling as she pressed the trigger. They sacrificed themselves willingly. Vorath's psychological advisor reported, "This is not the desperation of a cornered animal. This is deliberate tactical choice. They calculate that one human life is worth 30 Carvathi lives, and they consider this an acceptable trait." The concept was so alien to Carvathi, thinking that many officers simply could not process it. For the hegemony valued survival above all else. And the idea of choosing death when life remained possible seemed like madness. But the humans did not see it as madness. They saw it as victory. Vorath pulled forces from the front lines to reinforce his occupation garrisons. And the human fleet immediately exploited the weakness, striking at supply lines and communication stations with renewed aggression. He reinforced the front lines and the occupied worlds, erupted in violence that claimed hundreds of Carvathi lives. There was no winning configuration. Every success created a new failure. Every strength revealed a new weakness. And Vorath began to understand why Threk had returned with dead eyes and a broken spirit. "We control 3 human worlds," his operations officer reported at a morning briefing. "But we have lost more soldiers to insurgency than we lost taking those worlds in the first place. Our supply lines are stretched to breaking, and fleet readiness has dropped by 40% due to crew exhaustion and psychological casualties. We are winning," Vorath insisted. "We hold territory. We destroy their ships. We advance toward their homeworld." "With respect, Admiral," the officer replied quietly, "they are not trying to stop our advance. They are trying to make our advance cost more than we can afford to pay. And I believe they are succeeding." Vorath relieved the officer from duty. But he could not silence the truth in those words when his second year of campaign ended. Vorath had captured 5 human worlds and destroyed dozens of human ships. And by any standard measurement, the Carvathi were winning the war. But his fleet had shrunk from 40 ships to 28. Not from major battles, but from the constant bleeding of small attacks and accidents and sabotage. His occupation forces required constant reinforcement. His supply lines stretched across hostile space where every convoy was a gamble. And his soldiers had begun to whisper that the humans could not be beaten. Only delayed Vorath sent his report to the council, claiming victory while his eyes betrayed the truth. The council debated for weeks. And finally, they made the decision that everyone had known was coming since Threk's return. They summoned High Admiral Zorath, the greatest military mind in Carvathi history, the conqueror of empires, the commander who had never lost a campaign, was given supreme authority over the human war and unlimited resources to achieve final victory. Zorath accepted the command without celebration. He already knew what he would find when he studied the reports, and he already knew what the council would not want to hear. High Admiral Zorath did not immediately take command of the fleet. Instead, he retreated to his private chambers aboard the Eternal Dominion and summoned every war scholar and historian in the hegemony service, filling his rooms with ancient texts and modern analyses, and the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had conquered 100 species, but he did not ask them about Kovathi history. "You will study humanity," he told the assembled scholars, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, not their military capabilities, not their technology, not their current tactics. "I want to know how they think. I want to know what drives them. I want to understand the species we are fighting." The scholars worked for weeks, translating human texts and analyzing human records and piecing together a picture of a species that defied everything the Kovathi believed about warfare and survival. When they finally presented their findings, they spoke for hours. They spoke of a place called Stalingrad, where human soldiers fought building by building and room by room against an invader, refusing to retreat even when their city burned around them, choosing to die in the rubble rather than surrender a single street. They spoke of a small nation called Vietnam that fought against enemies many times, its size for decades without breaking, using tunnels and traps and infinite patience to bleed mighty empires until those empires simply gave up and went home. They spoke of a walled enclosure called the Warsaw Ghetto, where humans who had been starved and brutalized rose up against their oppressors with homemade weapons, knowing they would die, choosing to die fighting rather than die submitting. They spoke of something called the Blitz, where human cities were bombed night after night, and the humans simply rebuilt during the day and went about their lives, refusing to break, refusing to flee, refusing to acknowledge that they should be defeated. Zareth listened to all of it with his ancient eyes growing darker with each account. When the scholars finished, silence filled the chamber, broken only by the soft hum of the ship's systems and the rapid breathing of historians who had glimpsed something that shook their understanding of the universe. "Do you understand now?" Zorath asked quietly. "Do you see what we are facing?" One scholar, braver than the others, spoke up. "We see a species with a remarkable tolerance for suffering." "High Admiral, but tolerance is not the same as strength. Eventually, even the most stubborn enemy must accept defeat." Zorath shook his head slowly. "You still do not understand. Let me make it clear." He rose from his seat and walked to a display screen, calling up an image of a human soldier from one of the reports. A young female with dirt on her face and exhaustion in her eyes, but something else there too. Something that burned beneath the weariness. "Every species we have conquered shared one fundamental belief," Zorath said. "They believed that survival was the highest priority. When defeat became certain, they surrendered because living under Kovathi rule was preferable to extinction. This is rational. This is sane. This is how civilized beings behave." He touched the screen, and the image changed, showing a human city in flames, its defenders still fighting from the rubble, even as the fires consumed everything around them. Humans do not share this belief. The scholar shifted uncomfortably, and Zorath continued with a voice that had grown cold and quiet. "When you push a human to the breaking point, they do not break, they transform. They become something that does not calculate odds or measure acceptable losses. They become something that will burn their own worlds to ash before letting an enemy claim them. They become something that views death not as defeat but as defiance." He pulled up another image, this one showing the aftermath of a suicide attack. Kovathi bodies scattered across a command center. A human will strap explosives to their body and walk smiling into a room full of enemies, not because they want to die, but because they have decided that their death will purchase something worth dying for. They trade their lives for our officers, our morale, our certainty that we will win. "Surely this is desperation," another scholar offered weakly. "The behavior of a cornered animal." "No," Zorath said firmly. "A cornered animal fights because it has no choice. Humans choose to fight when surrender is possible. They choose to die when survival is offered. They look at impossible odds, and they smile because they know something we do not. He turned to face the scholars directly, and they saw something in his eyes that none of them had ever expected to see in the face of the hegemony's greatest warrior fear. "I can destroy humanity," Zorath said slowly. "I have calculated the cost. We would need to commit 60% of our active fleet. We would suffer 4 generations of population decline from the casualties. We would lose at least 11 cool worlds to their weapons of last resort." "What weapons?" a scholar asked. "They call them planet crackers," Zorath replied. "Devices capable of rendering a world uninhabitable, buried deep beneath their colonies, hidden where we cannot find them, and they will use them. They have made this absolutely clear. If we attempt to exterminate them, they will take as many of our worlds with them as they can reach." The scholars stared in horror, but that would accomplish nothing, one protested. "If they are destroyed anyway, what purpose does destroying our world serve?" Zora smiled bitterly. "You are thinking like a Corvasi. You believe that action should serve survival. Humans believe that action should serve meaning. And to them, dying while taking their enemy with them is meaningful. It is victory of a kind we cannot comprehend." He deactivated the display and stood in darkness for a long moment. "I am the greatest military mind the hegemony has ever produced. I have conquered 37 species. I have broken empires and burned civilizations. I have faced enemies with superior technology, and enemies with superior numbers, and enemies with nothing left to lose. And I have never known fear in battle." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But I fear the humans. Not because they can defeat our fleets, they probably cannot, but because victory against them will cost us everything we are. To win this war, we will have to become like them. We will have to abandon our principles and our honor and our belief that survival matters more than destruction. And I do not believe our civilization would survive that transformation." The scholars had no response as Zorath dismissed them and spent the night alone, staring at the stars and thinking about a species that had somehow evolved to view annihilation as an acceptable outcome. In the morning, he would go before the council with his recommendation. It would not be a battle plan. The council chamber fell silent as High Admiral Zorath finished his presentation. A silence so complete that the soft hum of the ship's systems seemed deafening, and the assembled commanders stared at their greatest warrior with expressions that shifted between disbelief and outrage and something that might have been terror. "You recommend peace," Councilor Mrath said finally, his ancient voice cracking with emotion. "You, Zorath, conqueror of the Velith Combine, destroyer of the Mrathian hive worlds. You stand before this council and recommend that we negotiate with these primitives as if they were our equals." Zorath stood unmoved by the accusation and Wrath's words. "I recommend survival," he replied simply. The chamber erupted. Commanders shouted over each other, some demanding that Zorath be removed from command, others arguing that his assessment must be flawed, still others insisting that the honor of the hegemony could not permit retreat from such an inferior enemy. Admiral Vorath, who had returned from the front lines to attend this meeting, rose with fury burning in his eyes. "I held 5 human worlds," he declared. "I pushed their fleets back toward their core systems. I killed 10 of their soldiers for every one of ours that fell. And you tell me that we are losing this war. You tell me that my victories mean nothing." Zorath waited for the noise to subside before responding. "You held 5 worlds at the cost of 12 ships and 40,000 soldiers. Those worlds continue to resist, requiring constant reinforcement that bleeds our reserves. And the humans have already retaken one of them while you traveled here for this meeting." Vorath's face paled, but his anger remained. "Then we commit more forces. We crush their resistance with overwhelming power. We show them that fighting is futile. We tried that approach with the Velith Combine," Zorath said quietly. "Do you remember what happened?" The chamber went silent again. For everyone present remembered the Velith campaign, a brutal war that had ended when the Korvathi fleet arrived in orbit around the Rindarend. Velith homeworld and the entire species had surrendered rather than face extinction. The Velith chose to live. Zorath continued. Even as subjects, even as a conquered people, they preferred existence to annihilation, and because of this choice, we were able to integrate them into the hegemony. Today, they serve in our fleets and contribute to our economy, and their population has recovered to pre-war levels. He paused and let his gaze sweep across the assembled commanders. The humans will not make this choice. You cannot know that. Vareth protested. I know it because they have already shown us, Zorath replied. I know it because they fight when they should surrender and die when they should flee. I know it because their history is written in the blood of those who underestimated their willingness to suffer. He activated the display behind him, showing a map of Korvathi space with the human territories highlighted in red. I can destroy humanity. This is not in question. Our fleets are larger. Our technology is superior. Our resources are vastly greater. If we commit everything we have to this war, we will eventually overcome their resistance and burn their worlds to ash. He touched the display and 11 Korvathi worlds began to flash with warning indicators. But they will take these worlds with them. Their planet crackers are real. Our intelligence has confirmed their existence and their capabilities. When we push them to extinction, they will trigger these devices and render 11 of our core systems uninhabitable for 1,000 generations. Murmurs spread through the chamber as commanders realized which worlds were highlighted. Ancient colonies, industrial centers, worlds with populations in the billions. And even if we accept those losses, Zorath continued, we will emerge from this war weakened, our fleets reduced to a fraction of their current strength. Our population decimated by casualties and the loss of those 11 worlds. And every species we have conquered will see that the Korvathi can be hurt, that we can be made to bleed, that fighting us carries a price we are willing to pay, but perhaps they should not have been. The implications hung in the air like poison. You suggest that victory would weaken us more than defeat. Councilor Mrath said slowly, I suggest that this enemy offers us a choice between two types of defeat. Zorath replied, we can destroy them and destroy ourselves in the process. Spending a century rebuilding what we lost while our subject species grow restless and our rivals grow bold. Or we can make peace and gain an ally whose ferocity will be directed outward alongside us rather than against us. Ally, Voreth spat. You would have us ally with creatures who paint themselves like plants and hide in shadows. I would have us ally with creatures who made our greatest fleet look like fools, who turned occupation into a nightmare that killed more soldiers than open warfare, who looked at the Korvathi hegemony and saw not an unstoppable force, but a challenge to be overcome. Zorath's voice grew hard. I have spent my life studying war. And I tell you now that humanity is the most dangerous species we have ever encountered. Not because of their technology or their numbers, but because they do not think like prey. They think like predators who have learned to be patient. And I would rather have such a species standing beside us than standing against us. The debate raged for 3 days. Zorath answered every objection with data and analysis, showing the council projections of casualty rates and resource expenditures, demonstrating the likely responses of subject species to a weakened hegemony, laying out in cold detail the true cost of exterminating humanity. In the end, a vote passed by a single margin. 6 months later, the council chamber looked very different. Its walls decorated with banners from both civilizations. Its seats filled with representatives of two species who had been killing each other a year before. Ambassador Sarah Chun walked to the center of the Chu-Tzinzir of the room with the careful steps of someone who knew that every eye was watching her. A small human woman surrounded by creatures twice her size whose ancestors had conquered galaxies. She did not seem intimidated, High Admiral. Zorath watched her approach the podium where the peace treaty waited, and he saw in her calm confidence everything that had made him argue for this outcome. This was not a defeated enemy coming to accept terms. This was a dangerous predator agreeing to hunt alongside a former rival. The people of Earth extend their gratitude to the Corvathi hegemony, Chum said, her voice clear and steady. We came to the stars expecting to find wonders, and instead we found war, but we also found something we did not expect. We found a species wise enough to recognize that some victories are not worth winning. She signed the treaty with a flourish. We look forward to showing the galaxy what our two species can accomplish together. The chamber filled with polite applause, but Zorath noticed how many of his fellow commanders watched the small human with wary eyes. These were warriors who had crushed civilizations, officers who had faced death without flinching, veterans who feared nothing in the known universe, and yet they watched Ambassador Chun the way prey watches a predator that has agreed not to hunt them. She caught Zorath's eye across the chamber and smiled, a warm expression that did not quite reach her eyes. And in that moment Zorath knew he had made the right choice. The humans had not been defeated. They had simply decided that peace served their purposes better than war. For now, and the Corvathi would spend the coming centuries learning what that meant. Zorath found himself smiling back for the first time in his long career. He had faced an enemy he could not defeat, and somehow this felt like victory.